No surrender. No retreat. The Empire will burn. Ambassador Dorian Vex kept his stance rigid, eyes locked onto the towering alien before him. The Imperial Grand Arbiter, Xiphus Kell, loomed over the negotiation table, his bioluminescent ridges flaring in a show of barely contained disdain. The throne chamber was a monstrous construct of arrogance, walls sculpted from entire planets' worth of crystal, the floor a glistening obsidian mirror reflecting the assembled rulers of the Galactic Senate. Yet despite the grandeur, there was rot. The Empire was a beast bloated on centuries of unchallenged rule, its strength built not on war, but the illusion of inevitability. It was a civilization that had never known an enemy it couldn't break. Until now. Xiphos's mandibles clicked in amusement. We have indulged this charade long enough. His secondary arms gestured lazily at the display hovering between them, a laser plasma projection of Sol, marked in crimson as an unsecured system. His elongated pupils shrank as his voice hardened. Your people will submit, Ambassador. That is the only course of action that leaves your homeworld intact. Dorian exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to smile. The Empire's mistake had already been made. You misunderstand something fundamental, Arbiter. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. You think we came here to beg? We didn't. This meeting is not diplomacy. It's a warning. The council chamber's usual murmurs had stilled, pressing stillness that bore down on the ears. Dorian let it sit for a moment longer, then placed a small cylindrical device onto the table. It was unassuming. Black, smooth, utterly featureless, yet the energy in the room shifted the moment it touched the surface. Xiphos's ridges dimmed slightly. A threat, then? Dorian tilted his head. Number just information. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the device. The laser plasma projection shifted. It was no longer an image of Sul. It was the Imperial Armada, the very fleet the Empire had mobilized for this final pacification. Dozens of Colossus-class dreadnoughts, planetary siege platforms, and thousands of escort warships, all currently en route to Earth's system. But something was wrong. The ships were marked as destroyed. Xiphos's throat sacs flared, a visible tremor shuddering through his massive form. Impossible. Dorian smiled, and this time he let it show. You expected a battle. There was none. You expected resistance. None was needed. He gestured at the display, at the flashing wreckage of a once invincible force. Your fleets were erased before they even reached firing range. He turned, walking away from the table. The Galactic Empire just made its first and final mistake. Behind him, the chamber erupted into chaos. Grand Admiral Rethar Vaughn stared into the vastness of space, a hollow sense of anticipation filling his gut. The Sol system lay before them, a single insignificant star with barely a handful of habitable planets. His fleet, the Third Imperial Expanse, was an unstoppable force. Billions of tons of metal, weaponry, and the pride of the Empire's military, all converging on a world that shouldn't have been able to resist. Commander, his adjutant, Jek Thurix, called from the heads-up display at the command deck's center. We're nearing the designated battle zone. Scans show no mobilization from the human forces. They are either unprepared or... He hesitated. Rethar frowned. Or what? Thurix's lower arms twitched. Or we're walking into something we don't understand. The Grand Admiral exhaled, dismissing the thought. The Empire did not walk into traps. Have all ships form an engagement line. Shields at maximum. Prepare for planetary bombardment. A tremor rippled through the bridge. No alarms blared. No impact indicators flashed across their displays. Just a deep, bone-rattling shudder, like something massive shifting just out of sight. "Report!" Rethar barked. Then, without warning, ships began disappearing. Not destroyed, not attacked, just gone. One moment, the formation was solid. The next, entire wings of dreadnoughts were missing from the displays. Their identifiers blinked off like dying embers. What is happening? Officers scrambled over their stations. The heads-up displays flickered erratically, trying to recalibrate. But the only response they got were frantic distress calls cut off mid-transmission. "Something's inside our formation," Thurix gasped, his voice nearly cracking. "It's not cloaking technology, it's something else." A flicker of movement, not from the front lines, but from the Empire's rear flank, where the reserve ships were stationed, untouched. They were supposed to be safe. They were the first to die. The black ships moved like phantoms, emerging from the void itself. No thruster trails, no drive signatures. Their matte exteriors absorbed all sensor scans, rendering them nothing more than whispers in the dark. And then, the slaughter began. No warning shots, no demands. Just kinetic hellfire, railgun slugs launched at near-relativistic speeds, punching through Imperial hulls like wet parchment. A single black ship passed beneath the ISS Dominance, a battleship that had led over 30 successful planetary campaigns. A stream of tungsten rounds tore through its spinal core, severing the ship in half. No explosions, just death. One by one, the Empire's mightiest war machines were picked apart. Rathar's blood ran cold. "Activate all emergency warp drives! Retreat!" But no ship jumped. Space itself had been locked. Jamming fields unlike anything the Empire had ever encountered caged them in, forcing them to die within the black abyss. And as his flagship's hull cracked open like a dying beast, Grand Admiral Rathar Vaughn understood the truth. The Empire had never been the predator. Humanity had never been the prey. Xiphos Kel's mandibles clenched so hard, they cracked. "This is deception. It cannot be real." Dorian Vex turned, his expression unreadable. "You know it is." The laser plasma display flickered, the data solidifying in real time. The Empire's largest military force was gone. The Galactic Senate, once a beacon of unchallenged rule, now sat stunned. Dorian picked up the small device from the table, tucking it into his coat. "This war is over before it begins." Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving the Empire to choke on its own arrogance. Dorian Vex walked through the towering corridors of the Imperial Senate, his footsteps echoing that had swallowed the chamber whole. He did not look back. The moment he had left that room, the power in the galaxy had shifted. He could feel it. The Galactic Empire had spent centuries crushing defiance with overwhelming force. But now, as their fleets lay shattered in the void, the truth settled in their bones like a creeping frost. They weren't invincible. They never had been. His fingers brushed against the smooth cylinder hidden within his coat, the small device that had detonated the Empire's arrogance without a single shot fired in that chamber. Information was the sharpest blade humanity wielded, and today they had carved the first deep wound. As he reached the docking bay, the towering figure of Commander Tiber Havoc was already waiting by the shuttle, his gaze dark, calculating. He didn't salute. Never did. But there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them. Havoc had been the architect of what had unfolded hours ago in deep space. Every intercepted transmission, every false data packet seeded into Imperial systems, every trap laid in the dark, they all bore his signature. Havoc leaned against the shuttle's entrance, arms crossed. "They're scrambling." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "Their private channels are a storm of distress calls and incomplete fleet reports. No one in that chamber believed you. Not really. But the admirals?" Havoc exhaled sharply. "They know something's wrong. The one's still alive anyway." Dorian stepped into the shuttle, the metal ramp retracting behind them. "How many ships actually made it out? Of the initial invasion force?" Havoc's expression was unreadable as he slid into the co-pilot's seat. 5. Maybe less. They fled before they fully grasped what was happening." He brought up a laser plasma display, streams of intercepted Imperial data flashing across it. Most of them weren't destroyed in direct combat. They were just erased. Dorian watched as Havoc ran the playback, grainy, fragmented footage from an Imperial vessel that had barely managed to escape. The black ships were there, barely distinguishable against the void, moving like wraiths through the wreckage. No visible propulsion, no heat signatures, just shadows flickering between ruined battleships, cutting them apart with silent efficiency. The display stuttered, distorting as the recording's final moments played out. One of the black ships passed near the fleeing Imperial cruiser, its sleek, jagged hull momentarily illuminated by the flickering wreckage of a dreadnought. Then the Imperial ship's sensors simply failed. Not jammed, not overloaded, just gone. Dorian leaned back, his fingers steepled. And the survivors? Havoc's expression darkened. Terrified. The ones we let live will be their own worst enemies. They'll return home and spread fear faster than we ever could. He tapped the console, shutting off the display. The Senate will pretend this is salvageable, but their fleets? They'll hesitate before the next engagement. They'll doubt their commanders. They'll question whether orders are being given by the right people or by someone who's already dead. A slow smirk tugged at Dorian's lips. Paranoia is a beautiful thing. The shuttle lifted off, the cityscape of the Imperial capital shrinking beneath them. Enormous spires of crystalline structures stretched toward the sky, their reflective surfaces gleaming under the system's twin suns. Below, the Empire's citizens moved about their daily lives, oblivious to the war that had already slipped into their homes like a whisper in the dark. Havoc exhaled, his fingers drumming against the armrest. You think Xiphus will act? He'll have to, Dorian said, his voice even. The Senate needs to maintain control. They can't let the outer systems see them shaken. He glanced toward the heads-up display, where the real-time transmission logs from Imperial channels scrolled past. They'll mobilize the 2nd and 4th Fleets next. They'll send them to pacify the situation. Havoc let out a quiet chuckle, humorless. They still think this is a war they can fight. They have no other framework for understanding what's happening to them, Dorian said, watching the Imperial capital shrink into the void. Empires collapse in two ways, violently or from within. We're giving them both. Havoc tilted his head, considering. What about the ones who haven't figured it out yet? The warlords, the admirals who still think brute force is the answer? Dorian's fingers drummed lightly against his knee. Let them come. As if on cue, a new transmission flared across the display, an Imperial emergency signal, urgent and classified, broadcasting across multiple systems. It originated from Admiral Threx Volkar, one of the highest-ranking military leaders still alive after the catastrophe. Havoc skimmed through it. He's demanding an immediate counteroffensive, claims the Empire still holds the strategic advantage. Dorian arched an eyebrow. And how does he justify that? Havoc smirked, flicking the message onto the display for him to read. Because we haven't officially destroyed a single Imperial world. He thinks we lack the capability for sustained planetary warfare. Dorian exhaled slowly. He's looking at the wrong battlefield. He tapped into the Imperial comms, rerouting his signal through the very network they thought was secure. His voice would reach every high-ranking military officer still standing in the Empire, whether they wanted to hear it or not. Admiral Volkar, Dorian began, his voice smooth, almost conversational. You're looking for an enemy that fights on your terms. You won't find one. The war you think you're in doesn't exist. There was no response, but he knew they were listening. You believe your ships will crush us in open battle, he continued, that your fleets will regroup, reorganize, retaliate. He leaned forward slightly, fingers grazing the edge of the console. But you've already lost. You just don't know it yet. A heavy pause. Then a new signal broke through. Not an Imperial one. A civilian transmission, open frequency, no encryption. Dorian's gaze sharpened as he read the identifiers. It was coming from one of the Empire's own core worlds. Havoc's jaw tightened as he scanned the message. This isn't an attack report. This is a plea. The message was short, but its implications echoed louder than any explosion could. The Empire has fallen. Dorian leaned back, a slow smile forming as the message repeated. It hadn't even been a full cycle since the first engagement. They weren't just breaking the Empire's fleets. They were breaking its belief in itself. The Imperial Treasury satellites drifted in slow, measured orbits above Vorak Prime, their exteriors gleaming under the dim glow of the system's dying sun. They were fortresses in their own right, each the size of a city, layered with defense grids and encryption walls built to withstand cyber warfare, infiltration, and brute force assaults. For centuries, they had safeguarded the Empire's lifeblood, the economic veins that stretched across the galaxy, keeping entire fleets fueled and planetary industries running. And now they were bleeding. Inside Command Station Oryx, an alarm pulsed through the control deck, a high-frequency alert meant only for crises of planetary devastation. Imperial Comptroller Vec Lorst gripped the edge of his command console, his deep-set eyes scanning the live feed from the satellite network. The numbers were wrong. Billions of credits had been drained from key accounts in the last hour. Unauthorized transactions, all executed from within their own system. Impossible. Every security layer should have made this kind of breach unthinkable. "Get me a direct feed to the central bank," he barked, voice strained as he fought to contain the rising dread curling through his gut. A lieutenant, his scaled hands jittery, fumbled with the controls before shaking his head. "Sir, the central bank's laser plasma transmission lines are unresponsive. All outbound connections are dead." Vec's mouth went dry. "What about our reserves?" The lieutenant hesitated. Then his voice came out as a whisper. "Gone." A weighted silence fell over the deck. The number flashing on the heads-up display wasn't just lower. It was 0. Every planetary government, every war fund, every high-ranking official's personal vault, emptied. The room swayed, or maybe it was just his vision. That's not possible. And then the primary laser plasma display flickered to life. The Imperial sigil, once a symbol of absolute dominion, now distorted into something else. A voice followed, a transmission embedded deep into their systems, overriding their entire network. Dorian Vex. His tone was steady, devoid of theatrics, but the weight behind it was suffocating. "You've mistaken your wealth for power." The message repeated on every Imperial-controlled world, projected onto city billboards, streaming across encrypted military channels, whispering into the personal comm lines of every fleet admiral. "Your fleets don't move without fuel. Your industries don't build without credits. Your governors don't rule without leverage. And now you have none of it." Vec's claws dug into the metal panel beneath his hands, the ridges of his forehead burning with realization. This wasn't just a financial attack. This was the spine of the Empire snapping in real time. "Find out where the credits went," he snarled, forcing himself upright. "Trace the outgoing." "They didn't leave the system, sir," another officer cut in, voice hollow. "They just stopped existing." Vec's breath caught. No theft, no redistribution, just deletion. His world was unraveling. Deep beneath the surface of Mars, inside a chamber shielded from any known method of detection, Commander Tiber Havoc monitored the fallout. His team of cyber warfare specialists sat in near-total darkness, their faces illuminated only by the shifting blue hues of their heads-up displays. The Empire still hadn't realized how deep the knife had gone. Havoc tapped a command into his terminal, watching as the last automated systems executed their final orders. The Empire had assumed its security networks were impenetrable. Its economy too vast to be crippled overnight. But the Black Network, humanity's hidden infrastructure, had been inside it for years. This wasn't about stealing wealth. That would have left a trail. This was about making the concept of imperial currency itself worthless. Every ledger wiped. Every savings account converted into unreadable code. Every debt suddenly meaningless. He turned to his second-in-command, Eric Dorn, a man whose dry wit often masked the brutal efficiency of his methods. "That should do it," Dorn said, stretching. "They'll realize in a few hours that no matter how many troops they have left, they can't pay them." Havoc allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Not many soldiers die for free." Dorn leaned back in his chair, watching as the final logs scrolled down the display. "You think they'll send a kill squad after us for this?" Havoc shrugged. "Let them try." Outside, in the silent corridors of the underground facility, nothing moved. The world above churned in ignorance, unaware that beneath its surface, the largest empire in galactic history was unraveling one line of code at a time. High Admiral Threx Volkar stood on the bridge of the ISS Valor, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the fractured remains of what had once been the Third Fleet. He had received no new orders from the Senate in the last 2 hours, and that disturbed him more than the loss of the invasion force itself. Admirals did not operate in quietness. The Empire thrived on strict hierarchy, a chain of command so absolute that even planetary governors bowed to fleet command. Yet now, across the Empire's encrypted battle net, there was nothing. No requests for retaliation, no counteroffensive strategy, just static. His second-in-command, Captain Vorlosh, stepped forward, his feathered crest raised in tension. "High Admiral, I have received word from Vorak Prime." Volkar turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "Go on." "Sir, the central bank has collapsed. There are no remaining military funds." For the first time in decades, Volkar felt something tighten in his chest, a warning, ancient and primal. The Empire had built its fleets on raw numbers, on the belief that war was sustained through overwhelming force. That belief had just been ripped out from under them. His jaw clenched. "We do not require credits to fight." Vorlosh hesitated. "Our forces do, sir. Our fleet suppliers, our system governors, the mercenary houses, even the fueling stations along our outer sectors. No one is moving. Everyone is waiting." Volkar's pulse thundered in his ears. That was the final, cruel brilliance of it all. Humanity hadn't needed to fight a battle here. They had made it so the Empire could no longer afford one. The bridge remained silent, the weight of realization settling into the bones of every officer present. And then the final transmission came through, the one that sent a ripple of unease through even the most hardened veterans. A civilian broadcast from an imperial world. The message was brief. "The war is over." Volkar's hands tightened into fists. Number not yet. But deep in his gut, he knew the truth. The moment an Empire's own citizens stopped fearing it, the Empire itself was already dead. He turned toward his officers, his voice low, sharp. "Prepare for a counterstrike. We find them. We end this." But he could already see it in their expressions. The question that had begun creeping into the minds of every surviving commander. What if we already lost? The silence in the Imperial War Council chamber was suffocating. Not the kind bred from contemplation, but the kind that came when men who had never known fear suddenly found themselves drowning in it. High Admiral Threx Volkar stood motionless, his gaze locked on the laser plasma display dominating the central podium. It pulsed with grim updates, military accounts frozen, reserve fleets immobilized, supply chains severed. The credits they needed to fund their war effort were gone. Not stolen, but erased, as if the wealth of the Empire had never existed. The murmuring among his subordinates grated at him, the disbelief clinging to their words like rot. The civilians are losing confidence. Merchants are refusing to refuel our carriers without. The outer systems won't even answer Senate directives anymore. Enough! Volkar's voice slammed into the room, cutting through their panic like a blade. He turned slowly, scanning the assembled warlords, admirals, and planetary commanders. They had ruled through fear, through the knowledge that the Empire could always outlast, outspend, outgun any opposition. But now, their fleets drifted like corpses in a tide, their war machine grinding to a halt not from battle, but from something worse. Dorian Vex had stolen something more valuable than ships or soldiers. He had stolen inevitability. Volkar's fists clenched. The Empire does not need wealth to fight. We have fleets. We have weapons. We have billions of loyal subjects ready to die. He leaned forward, his glare settling on the weakest among them, daring them to contradict him. This is nothing but an inconvenience. A tense silence followed. Then slowly a voice cut through it. Then prove it, Admiral. Volkar turned. Counselor Sen Tyvus stood with his arms folded, his exoskeletal plating gleaming under the artificial lights. Unlike the others, Tyvus showed no fear, no anxiety. His people, the Varakians, were pragmatic to a fault. You speak of loyalty, but your troops will not march without promise of reward. You speak of strength, but your fleets cannot move without fuel. Show us that the Empire is not already dead. Volkar's jaw tightened. You want proof? He gestured toward the display, his voice iron. We take Titan's Gate. The murmurs returned, but this time they carried a different note. Caution. Titan's Gate was more than a strategic outpost. It was the last human-controlled stronghold within striking distance of the Empire's core systems. If they could crush it, the psychological blow alone would restore order. If they failed, the narrative would be cemented. Humanity wasn't just winning, they were unstoppable. Tyvus exhaled sharply, his mandibles tightening. It will require all remaining mobile forces. We cannot afford hesitation. Volkar's eyes darkened. Then there will be none. Titan's Gate hung in the void like an ancient sentinel, its structure a mixture of industrial brutality and cold efficiency. A relic of a forgotten war, it had been abandoned for decades until humanity reclaimed it. Now it stood as the threshold between order and chaos, a final bastion before the Empire's remaining forces. Commander Eric Dorn stood in the observation deck, watching the heads-up display as Imperial fleet markers converged like a tightening noose. The enemy was committing everything to this assault. Battleships, planetary siege cruisers, raiding skirmishers, all falling into a rigid, predictable formation. A mistake. He turned as Tiber Havoc entered the room, the strategist's face unreadable. They took the bait, Havoc murmured, eyes flicking over the enemy fleet projections. Volkar's rolling everything into this. He thinks this is about proving Imperial dominance. Dorn exhaled through his nose. It's not. No, Havoc agreed. This is about proving he still matters. Dorn gestured to the display where Titan's Gate defenses blinked into activation. Ion suppression fields, electromagnetic disruptors, decoy drone swarms. They weren't going to fight Volkar's fleet head-on. They weren't going to let the Empire dictate the terms of engagement. You've got the infiltrators in place, Dorn asked. Havoc gave a short nod. The moment Volkar's ships break into low orbit, they'll lose their own command network. Dorn let out a low chuckle. So the Empire's final stand will be against themselves. The Imperial fleet surged forward, thousands of ships cascading through space with mechanized fury. The lead war frigates opened fire first, their plasma bolts streaking toward Titan's Gate in a coordinated bombardment. The human outpost trembled under the assault, its external shields flickering under the strain. Inside the ISS Harbinger, Volkar stood at the forefront of his command deck, his golden war cloak draped over his shoulders like a mantle of inevitability. He watched as the human station took the brunt of their fire, its hull blackening, its defenses faltering. Finally, the Empire's greatest enemy would be erased in fire and steel. "Advance the ground teams," Volkar ordered. His officers relayed the command, and the first waves of Imperial Storm Legions deployed from the assault carriers, launching toward the station's compromised sections. That was when everything changed. The moment the first landing pods breached Titan's Gate's outer layer, the fleet's comms fractured. Displays blinked into erratic static. Targeting systems shut down mid-engagement. Volkar's heart pounded. What is this? Across the bridge, officers scrambled over the failing heads-up displays, voices laced with confusion and something worse, dread. A single transmission crackled through the distortion. A voice, not imperial, human, and it was laughing. "That's cute," came the voice, casual, amused. "You really thought we were going to let you fight this war on your terms?" Volkar's gut turned to ice. Suddenly, the Imperial ships turned on each other. It wasn't a deception. It wasn't hacking. The infiltrators planted within Volkar's fleet had rewritten command protocols before the battle had even begun. His admirals, his captains, his most trusted officers, half of them weren't Imperial anymore. Titan's Gate hadn't been the target. The Empire's own fleet was. One by one, Imperial dreadnoughts erupted from within, sabotaged reactor cores going critical. Battle cruisers that had been locked into firing solutions suddenly turned on their allies. Chain of command links severed, entire squadrons breaking apart in disarray. The last thing Volkar saw before the ISS Harbinger detonated was a single human warship drifting in the distance, a black ship, motionless, watching, and as his body was ripped apart by fire, the Empire's last great fleet died with him. Inside Titan's Gate, Dorn exhaled slowly as the final Imperial wreckage drifted into the abyss. Havoc crossed his arms, watching as the remaining enemy ships limped into retreat, leaderless, shattered. Dorn tilted his head. "You think they've figured it out yet?" Havoc smirked. "That they didn't lose this war today?" Dorn turned from the viewport, the remnants of the Empire's greatest fleet, nothing but debris in the distance. "No," he murmured, "that they lost it the day they thought we were weak." The wreckage of the Imperial fleet still smoldered in Titan's Gate's orbit, burning oxygen-rich fragments spiraling away into the void. What had once been the heart of the Empire's greatest war machine was now nothing but drifting debris, the skeletal remains of an arrogance too vast to see its own decay. A fleet so feared that entire worlds had surrendered at its arrival had been undone not by superior firepower, but by something far worse. Doubt, paranoia, the slow, agonizing realization that they were no longer in control of the story being told. Dorian Vex watched the heads-up display from his private chamber aboard the ISS Vengeance, his reflection merging with the shattered warships flickering across the screen. The death throes of the Imperial Armada had echoed across every encrypted channel, every desperate distress signal bouncing off the walls of an empire that no longer knew how to respond. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Commander Tiber Havoc entered without a word, his gaze already fixed on the report scrolling across the display. His presence carried the sharp edge of a man who had spent too many years waiting for a fight that had already ended before it began. "They're crumbling," Havoc murmured, scrolling past intercepted transmissions from Imperial warlords now turning on each other. The outer colonies aren't just refusing orders. They're actively severing ties. Entire planetary governments are declaring themselves independent. The Empire hasn't been defeated yet, but... His fingers drummed against the table. "It's dying. Faster than even we anticipated." Dorian exhaled, clasping his hands behind his back. "And Volkar?" Havoc glanced at him. "Gone." The weight of that single word settled between them. High Admiral Threx Volkar, the last unbroken warlord of the Empire, had been reduced to nothing but floating wreckage and an echo of arrogance. "There's still one last move left," Dorian said, turning away from the display. "The Emperor won't let this go unanswered. He'll make a final stand." Havoc scoffed. "He has no fleet, no allies, no treasury. What's he going to do? Pray?" Dorian's expression remained unreadable. "Number. He'll do what every desperate man does when he's spent his last piece." He looked at the secondary display where a red marker pulsed over the Imperial throne world. "He'll gamble with the only thing he has left, the illusion of power." Imperial Palace, Throne World Vorak Ultis. The grand corridors of the palace were empty, not abandoned, not in the way that cities fell silent after a curfew or streets grew quiet before a storm. This was something else, an absence of movement, of life. Councillor Sen Tyvus walked briskly past the shattered remains of marble pillars, their once pristine exteriors marred with the scorch marks of recent skirmishes. The royal guards, once the elite defenders of the Empire's core, lay motionless, their bodies crumpled in death where they had fallen. Some had been executed, others had taken their own lives. The doors to the Emperor's chamber loomed ahead, still intact, still unchallenged, but the power they once commanded was gone. The weight of history, of dominion, had been stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a hollow echo of what had once been absolute rule. Tyvus hesitated. For the first time in his life, then slowly he pushed the doors open. Inside, the Emperor sat alone. His robes were still pristine, flowing over the high-backed throne in elegant folds of deep crimson. But his crown, the circlet of dominion worn by 1,000 generations before him, lay discarded at his feet. His golden eyes, once burning with the arrogance of an empire that had never lost, now flickered with something different. Recognition. "I assume this is not a visit of loyalty," the Emperor said, his voice steady. Tyvus stepped forward. "No, Your Majesty." The Emperor's gaze drifted toward the laser plasma display embedded in the far wall. It still functioned, though barely. A fractured image of the Imperial fleet's last moments flickered across it, the death knell of his reign playing on an endless loop. He gestured at it, almost absently. "Do you know the difference between a king and a god, Counselor?" Tyvus didn't answer. The Emperor's lips curved, but there was no mirth in the expression. "A king rules by strength, a god rules by belief." His fingers tapped idly against the throne's armrest. "And once that belief is gone, so is the god." Tyvus felt something cold settle in his chest. The Emperor turned his gaze back to him. "I am no longer a god, am I?" Tyvus inhaled, his throat tightening. "No, Your Majesty." For a long moment there was silence. Then slowly, the Emperor reached down, lifting the discarded circlet from the ground. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the once immaculate engravings, now dulled with age and neglect. Then, without another word, he snapped it in two. The metallic shards hit the floor, the sound far too soft for what it represented. Tyvus swallowed. "What are your orders?" The Emperor exhaled. "There are none." He rose, the weight of his own mortality settling onto his shoulders like a final act. "The Empire is finished." He met Tyvus's gaze, something unreadable in his expression. "Tell them I surrendered. Let them carve their victory however they see fit." Tyvus hesitated, then bowed his head. "As you command." Dorian stood aboard the ISS Vengeance, watching the last encrypted transmission flicker across the heads-up display. The words were clear. "The Emperor has surrendered." A slow, measured silence settled over the command deck. Havoc exhaled beside him, shaking his head. "Just like that?" Dorian tilted his head. "Not just like that. He understood something the others didn't. Havoc smirked. That he was already dead? Dorian's gaze darkened. That the Empire died long before we got here. We just buried the body. Havoc let out a quiet laugh. And what do we do with a dead empire? Dorian turned away from the display, his fingers brushing over the device hidden in his coat, the same one he had placed before the Senate what felt like a lifetime ago. We decide what comes next. Havoc exhaled, glancing out at the void where the last remnants of the Empire had once stood. Hell of a thing. Dorian nodded. Yes. The last fragments of the Imperial throne drifted in silence, the final echoes of an empire erased not by conquest, but by inevitability. The Imperial throne world lay in silence, not the silence of peace, nor the silence of surrender. It was the silence of something vast and rotting, the kind of hush that lingered after the final breath of a dying monarch. The surrender had been transmitted, accepted, and dissected by every power that once bent the knee to the Empire. Yet the air remained thick with a tension that refused to settle, like a storm teetering on the edge of collapse, but unwilling to break. Dorian Vex stood at the command deck of the ISS Vengeance, his gaze fixed on the heads-up display projecting the last known movements of the remaining Imperial remnants. The map flickered with shifting data, tracing the slow fragmentation of a regime that had once claimed dominion over the stars. Borders that had been drawn in blood were now nothing more than suggestions, warlords carving up territory like scavengers descending on a still-warm corpse. Havoc leaned against the console, arms crossed. The pieces are scattering. Some of the governors are already setting up their own pocket empires. Others are going underground, waiting to see who rises from the ashes. Dorian exhaled. They won't find anything to rise from. Not this time. Havoc's brow lifted. You're sure about that? You really think no one's going to try to rebuild? Dorian glanced at the data streams running across the display, every intercepted transmission painting the same picture. A body still twitching, but dead all the same. The Empire was never about its fleets. It wasn't about its rulers, or its wealth, or even its armies. It was an idea, and that idea is gone. Havoc's gaze darkened. Ideas don't just vanish. Dorian turned to him, eyes cold. Number. But they can be replaced. Before Havoc could respond, an incoming alert flared across the display. A priority transmission, unidentified source, heavily encrypted, relayed from multiple shadow networks before reaching them. Havoc straightened. That's not Imperial. Dorian studied the encryption layers. They weren't military-grade, not Empire standard. If anything, they were more refined, layered in a way that suggested careful construction rather than brute force security. Someone hadn't just wanted to hide the message. They wanted only the right people to see it. Dorian gestured and the display stabilized, unraveling the message. A voice filled the command deck, distorted but unmistakably alien. You think it ends here. The words were slow, deliberate, not a question, a statement. You have won a war against ghosts and dying kings. You believe you have unraveled the chains that held this empire together. Havoc's jaw tightened. Who the hell is this? The voice continued, unfazed. But war does not vanish. It changes hands. And what you have done is not an end, but an invitation. Dorian narrowed his eyes, fingers brushing against the console. Identify the sender. The system flickered as it ran through decryption algorithms. No match. The voice resumed. You may not know us, but we have watched. We have learned. And now, we will see if you understand what you have created. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the transmission cut out. A silence stretched between them, heavier than before. Havoc exhaled, his expression unreadable. That's not an Imperial signal. Dorian stared at the blank display, his mind sifting through the implications. That was something else. A soft chime signaled the full trace report had finished processing. The location of the transmission's origin blinked onto the screen. Havoc frowned. That's... Dorian exhaled, the weight of realization settling onto his shoulders. It's coming from inside the former empire. Havoc let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. Of course it is. We didn't just burn the empire down. We left the pieces for someone else to pick up. Dorian turned away from the console, his gaze slipping toward the viewport where the shattered remnants of the Imperial fleet drifted. The question isn't who sent that message. Havoc nodded, catching the thread of his thoughts. It's what they're planning to do with what's left. The shadows of the old war had barely cooled, but already something new was stirring in the wreckage. Dorian Vex had spent his life dismantling the past. Now, he had to decide what came next. The ISS Vengeance drifted in the cold embrace of space, silent but alive with the weight of impending decisions. The command deck's heads-up displays pulsed with intercepted transmissions, each one a whisper of the storm creeping closer. The Empire was gone, its corpse still warm, but already new shadows were moving in the void it left behind. Dorian Vex stood motionless, his gaze locked on the fragmented data stream scrolling across the main console. The message from the unknown entity had been dissected, decrypted, analyzed from every angle. No identifiers, no known language markers, no pattern matching with any remaining Imperial factions. Someone had been waiting for the Empire's fall. And now, they were making their move. Havoc paced nearby, the sharp rhythm of his footsteps filling the space between them. If we wanted a clean ending, we should have burned the entire Imperial structure down to its foundations. Dorian's lips pressed into a thin line. A vacuum is never empty for long. Havoc turned, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. So what's the plan? We let them take over and hope they play nice? Dorian tapped a control panel, shifting the display to a live map of the Empire's former sectors. Red zones flickered across the screen, territories where local warlords had seized control, remnants of the old order still grasping for power. But nestled among them were new signals, coordinated movements, resource consolidations. Someone wasn't just scavenging the remains. They were building something. He exhaled, the weight of it all pressing against his ribs. We need to know who they are, what they want, and how far they're willing to go to get it. Havoc narrowed his eyes. You think they're another empire in the making? Dorian shook his head. Empires don't rise overnight. They take time, resources, and legitimacy. This is something else. Someone is capitalizing on the chaos before it settles. Havoc leaned over the console, studying the data. We could intercept their supply lines, sabotage their infrastructure before they establish a foothold. Dorian didn't respond immediately. He was watching the patterns emerge, the way the pieces were shifting. This wasn't random. This was methodical. Whoever was orchestrating it understood strategy, understood how to move unseen until it was too late to stop them. A soft chime signaled another incoming transmission, another anonymous burst. Dorian gestured for Havoc to put it through. The same distorted voice filled the command deck. You believe you are ahead, that you hold control over the shape of things to come. But control is an illusion. The moment you struck down the Empire, you opened a door. And now, something far older than you will step through it. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Havoc's jaw tightened. I don't like that. Dorian turned back to the map, his fingers drumming against the console. The pieces were there. He just had to see the shape of the whole board before the next move was made. He gestured toward the display. We're not playing offense or defense anymore. We're playing for the future. Havoc frowned. That sounds like politics. Dorian's expression darkened. It always was. He turned to the tactical display, eyes scanning the data with renewed focus. If this was a new power rising, they couldn't just react. They had to control the conditions before their enemy dictated the terms. "We need a three-layer approach," Dorian said, voice steady. "First, infiltration. We need to put our people inside whatever structure they're forming. I want eyes and ears before they realize we're watching." Havoc nodded. "We can use the old sleeper networks, the ones we embedded in the Empire before its collapse." Dorian tapped the next section of the plan. "Second, disruption. If they're consolidating power, they'll need infrastructure. We make sure every supply route they set up collapses before it becomes functional. Not just by attacking it, by turning their own people against them. Fear is a weapon as much as any railgun." Havoc smirked. "You're thinking of false betrayals, aren't you? Planting evidence, making them doubt each other before they even get started." Dorian nodded. "We don't need to fight them if they're too busy fighting themselves." He turned to the final section. "And the third phase, control. We don't destroy them. We own them before they even realize they've lost." Havoc raised a brow. "You want to turn them into another tool?" Dorian's voice was quiet, but unyielding. "Power doesn't come from ruling. It comes from deciding who does." The weight of the words settled between them. Havoc exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, I'll get the teams in position, but you know this won't end clean, right?" Dorian allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "It never does." As Havoc left to set the plan in motion, Dorian turned back to the display, watching the red zones shift like storm clouds on the horizon. A new war was coming, not of conquest, but of control. And for the first time in history, humanity wouldn't just survive it. They would shape it. Dorian Vex stood at the command deck of the ISS Vengeance, his gaze locked on the laser plasma display that pulsed with the last remaining traces of the old empire. The map of the galaxy had changed. The towering weight of the imperial regime had crumbled, leaving behind not silence, but movement. 100 factions scrambling to seize whatever power they could from the wreckage. But in the end, none of them had won. None of them had claimed the throne. Because there was no throne left to claim, Havoc entered without a word, his stride measured, his expression unreadable. He carried the weight of the last battle like a man who had seen the end of something greater than war. His arms remained crossed as he studied the same display, his jaw tightening at the sight of the remaining factions splintering further apart. Dorian didn't look at him as he spoke. "The last Imperial warlords have fractured beyond repair. Vorak Ultis is abandoned. There's no empire left, not even the ghost of one." Havoc exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Doesn't feel like a victory." Dorian's eyes flickered with something colder than satisfaction. "That's because we didn't conquer them." Havoc's fingers drummed against the edge of the console. "You think they'll ever recover?" Dorian tilted his head, as if considering. "Empires don't recover. They either adapt, or they fade into stories." Havoc let out a humorless chuckle. "And what do we do then? Build a new one?" Dorian turned, finally meeting his gaze. We erase the need for one." The words settled between them, heavy and unyielding. Humanity had done what no other force in the galaxy had dared. They had broken the very concept of absolute rule. The Senate had expected conquest. The warlords had braced for a new master, but there would be none. "We leave them with nothing to rally behind," Dorian continued, his voice low but resolute. "No singular enemy, no central figure to rebel against, no empire to resurrect. They'll turn on each other, their leaders too afraid of losing what little they have left." Havoc frowned. "So we keep pulling the strings from the shadows?" Dorian shook his head. "Not shadows. We don't rule. We guide. The difference between humanity and every empire before it is simple. We don't need to sit on a throne to decide how the future unfolds. Havoc studied him, his usual smirk absent. And if someone else tries to rise? If another empire starts to form? Dorian turned back to the display, watching as power continued to splinter, leaving behind a galaxy that would never again belong to a single ruler. Then we remind them, he said softly, why we broke the first one. Silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of something far greater than war. Humanity had not won in the way history had taught civilizations to measure victory. There was no seat of power waiting for them, no conquered capital to parade through. There was only the cold, undeniable truth. Humanity had proven something greater than superiority. They had proven inevitability. Dorian reached into his coat, retrieving the same small black device he had placed before the Galactic Senate at the start of it all. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of everything that had been decided before the first battle even began. Havoc watched him for a long moment. So, that's it then? Dorian smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth, only certainty. No, he said. This is just the beginning. And with that, he crushed the device in his hand, and the last remnants of the old order died forever.